Hi everyone. Today's tutorial is about alcohol ink designs using deco foil or craft foil on top. And I keep a collection of used project foils in a bag, and that's what I'll be using today. You just need leftovers really. You can use brand new. The substrate I'll be using is Yupo. I'm just showing a couple of types I have here. There's the Ranger and there's also Legion in both a small and large pad. And today I'll use the smaller of the two, which is the same size as this Ranger, and that's a 5x7 pad. So I'll use a sheet of that. I have some paper towel handy. The inks I'll use are Meadow, which is the green, and Cool Puri, which is the mauve. I also use isopropyl alcohol, 91% or greater is the strength best suited for this process. I also have some in a easy to handle dispensing bottle. It's like a shampoo travel bottle. And there's also some in a mini mister. This is a Ranger product. I won't be using the mini mister today, but I like to show it to you. It can come in very handy for some of the alcohol ink techniques. And the alcohol blending solution, this is a Ranger product as well, you will need for this particular technique with the foil. And I'm showing you some hand sanitizer that I just keep around. I can clean ink from my hands, and I can clean my hands before I handle the substrates, especially something like Yupo, but really anything that you're going to use, or most anything for alcohol ink, because if your hands aren't really clean, or if you drop something on the paper, or a little bit of grease or anything, it's going to act as a resist to the ink. Sorry, I will knock the camera base a couple of times in this video, I'll just forewarn you. Getting my inks ready, and I'm going to put down some of that isopropyl or rubbing alcohol onto the Yupo. And I actually start out by making an error, which is a good thing, because I think you should see that errors can happen, and if you learn from them, it's a great thing. Clearly I hadn't made this mistake before, but I started out by thinking I would mix both of these two colors, and green with purple or anything that's got red in it really wants to go brown quickly. Almost every combination of colors will eventually get you a brown, but this one is really fast. So what we'll see here is a couple of things. One is that where the drops went down onto the Yupo, even on places where there was already some alcohol, it stained a bit. Not to worry, because ultimately there'll be enough color on the Yupo that you won't even notice those stains. And in fact, even if there wasn't a whole bunch of extra color on the Yupo, the stains effectively become a shadow in the background, part of the background. So another beautiful thing about working with alcohol ink is that, and again, there's alcohol mixed in. I didn't like what was happening with the color. I just simply let it all run to the end and onto the paper towel, and that's easy. So there was still enough alcohol left on the paper that I decided to put down a little bit more of the Meadow, that green, and now it's doing a little bit more of what I'd hoped it would do. So I'm really just, for this particular piece, I want it to come out kind of like geodes, and I am not a geological person. I don't have a good solid understanding of anything to do with rocks, but geodes are those rocks or stones that when they're open they show the most beautiful veins of sort of crystal looking rock, among other really pretty colors of the stone. So sometimes they're purple, which is why I pulled out the Cool Puri, and greens and golds. And as a matter of fact, as this green is breaking down right now, it's going to, the pigment colors that make up this green are going to come apart because of the isopropyl alcohol. It's breaking the pigments down, and you'll see some yellows come out, which is kind of interesting. Ultimately, they'll come out looking amber, sort of a more amber than gold, but it's just interesting to see. And it's again part of the experimenting, is to see how the ink behaves, how it runs, what colors come of it, what affects those colors. So I've added a little bit more to the paper. You can see it's not really running well. And so because alcohol ink dries very quickly as well, All I'm really doing is moving it around enough so that I can spread some of the pigment around and get an idea. My plan wasn't to cover the entire page, though you certainly can, but not to cover the entire page with this particular green, because I do want that cool puree, which is quite a light color, to come through in the end piece. So I'm just kind of having a look at it, thinking about what I might want to do next. I did, as I've pointed out, use alcohol for this stage of this piece. Ultimately, I need to add the blending solution, which is why I've picked it up here. The blending solution acts a little bit differently than the alcohol. As you can see, it breaks down the pigment when I drop it on, so any ink that's already been there is going to get broken down by that blending solution. But the blending solution and combined with the ink and the pigments where they end up being deposited are what's going to form to be the sticky, tacky glue that holds that foil down. So alcohol, if you just use alcohol, it tends to make the inks really thin out. It gives beautiful effects, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't leave you with the tackier pieces like the blending solution will. So I wanted the background to be very smooth, and again with the theme of geodes and the idea of those geodes, that another beautiful thing about it, most alcohol inks, is that they tend to form circles and rounded. So I'm pleased with that, and I'm pointing out where in between those circles you can see that there is kind of rust amber forming pretty distinctly, and that has come about as the pigments in the green, the meadow, break down. And so I'm just wafting it back and forth. I want it to dry without the ink moving very much. So what I tend to do is kind of fan the paper a little bit. And I'll say this process, I think this video, I'm at about the halfway point now. It's about a 14-15 minute process for this particular one. You could probably do them faster. You could probably do them slower, but it's a little bit like watching paint dry, but I have to say, for me, a lot more interesting, because it's drying, but you're manipulating the drying or the movement of the ink or not, depending on how it's turning out. And if you're familiar with alcohol ink, you'll know that every time you put something else, whether it's a blending solution or the alcohol or another color of ink, onto it, it changes the image entirely. So what I'm wanting to do, as you can see, what's happening now is that there are areas forming on the piece that are the heavier areas of pigment. They're the ones that are going to be the most tacky, and in hoping that it will look sort of like geodes, which sometimes have several different veins of the crystal rock, I guess you'd call it, or crystal looking rock. I'm really just adding ink on top of ink in a drop at a time to form different rings. And while I don't have a ton of control over how and where the ink is going to become tacky, I'm doing my best to lay that ink down in places where I think it's going to form a ring, and perhaps I can get some of that foil. And you'll see there's, on the right hand side of the screen, the foil I will be using is a holograph star foil, and I thought it was the one that best suited the look of the geodes. Now I've taken out my craft dryer, which is really just a portable hair dryer, 2-speed. It's 20 odd years old. I'm sorry I don't know the brand, because I know people do ask for that, but this is just 2-speed. I usually use it on low. You could probably find them at a drugstore, discount store. If they have a cool setting, that's a great thing, because when you're working with alcohol and anything with solvents in it, it's a great thing to be able to have a cool setting, so you're not heating up the alcohol and creating more fumes, which are not very healthy. So this one I've used actually for this process, which is why it has some ink on the back. That's not going to hurt. But really what I'm trying to do before I lay down that foil is to sort of eyeball it and see if there, and I can see that there are some areas that are still too wet. And if it's wet, which we'll see here in a few minutes, really all it's going to do is pick up, those are the areas I'm pointing at that I'm hoping will pick up foil. But if it's too wet, the foil just picks up the ink. The foil does not get left back on the piece itself. And that would be mistake number 2, which I'll make in a few minutes. But, you know, again, you work through these things. It's not the end of the world, most definitely. There's all kinds of things, which I'll mention, that you can do to mitigate if you really don't like how it turns out. And alcohol ink can be modified, as I pointed out earlier, so many ways. If you don't like how something looks, fear not, you can probably put some alcohol on it, drip the ink all off if you really want to. But gee, I wouldn't even go that far, as you'll see in a few minutes. I decide, for some reason, after I put in a little bit more of the meadow green, and I'm going to go back and pick up a turquoise out of the picture in a moment, because I have this brainwave that I'm going to give that a go and see if the turquoise just doesn't add a little bit brighter color. But as we'll see when I drop the turquoise down, and here we go, it's going to behave very differently than what the meadow and the cool peri have done. Which I could have tested beforehand, but I tend to experiment this way. So I decided at least to go off to the very edge of the page. And it's hard to see really, but it's spreading beyond the lines that have naturally gone down as a circle. And so I decide, well, I can do a bit of a rescue. I pick up the blending solution, I'll put a couple of drops in, and that again has the effect of kind of waking up that turquoise and allowing the turquoise ink to be moved around. And it's clear to me as I'm working it, and really what I'm trying to do is just, move the ink around a bit so that it dries more quickly. But it's clear to me that I'm not going to get a circle out of this. And that the turquoise, as I pointed out, behaves very differently than the other inks on the page. So at this point, I'm quite optimistic. I decide I'll put a little bit more of the blending solution on it. And at the same time, I'll put a drop of the meadow green on top of the blending solution. Now, if the turquoise hadn't been underneath, it probably the green would have acted the same way it always has and kind of go out in a circle. But as you'll see, and partly it's because I'm moving it a bit, but it really does, because of the turquoise, it behaves very differently. So it gets a bit more runny, and that's fine. Really, it's going to become either a background or it might get cropped off. I have no idea. I'll just see how I feel about it once I'm done. And at this stage, I'm very hopeful that I've got tacky places, and I don't want them to go too long because they'll dry really quickly. So from the stage from tacky to completely dry, and you're not able to do this method, is very quick. So you'll see I've got the shiny side up, and really what I'm doing is just randomly going over, pushing down with my fingers, and that got a couple of really good pieces held down. And the ink is just behaving as a glue. So wherever it's able to adhere to that foil, and it's kind of the same tension as a bandage, you know, it's just a light pull, but wherever it adheres, it's going to leave the foil behind, and the foil would be glued right onto the alcohol ink. And I've been using this method for some time now, and I've seen videos about it. Never had a problem. This is another problem though. And again, no, I shouldn't say problem, but it was a challenge. So where I had put the turquoise ink and all that stuff, it was still wet. And so as you'll see, it picked up the ink. It didn't leave any of the foil because it wasn't tacky, but it left ink everywhere else. Not to worry, I'm just going to go back with a paper towel and some alcohol and wipe down my craft mat. But at this stage, I'm looking it over, and it looks to me as though that is pretty much what I wanted to achieve, and that's a wrap. So thank you for coming by, and here's a still of the final product so you can get a close-up to see some of the effects that I've been able to achieve this way. Thanks for joining me.